All right, let me move this down. Thank you, Dr. Tokash, for the introduction, and I just thank you all for being here this morning. Oh, okay, there we go. So just to reemphasize a little bit what Emmeline already said, as we all know, weaning is an extremely stressful event, if not the most stressful event that a pig faces in their lifetime. And because of that, we often see a significant impact on immediate post-weaning behavior, which subsequently leads to impacts on feed intake. This low feed consumption that we typically observe in the first 3 to 7 days after a pig is weaned results in what is commonly referred to as the post-weaning growth check, which for us can lead to increased morbidity and mortality in the herd. And so with that, we also have to think about all the intestinal stuff that's going on at the same time for these young pigs. So they have some extensive gastrointestinal maturation and development at this time. So when we consider this compounding level of stressors, both at a biological and environmental level, we really need to think about what kind of impact it has on these pigs, not just immediately after weaning, but throughout their production cycle. And so with that, today I'm going to talk to you about the outcomes of 9 different experiments that I've been involved with over the last year of my program, using just over 17,000 pigs. So these trials have been conducted at Kansas State University, as well as with Holden Farms and Pillin Family Farms. And then I also have to give a huge shout out to TechMix Incorporated, more specifically Denny McKilligan, for his role in getting this conversation started with us. And so to jump right in, the first study we're going to talk about is the effect of mat feeding on the removal rate and mortality of pigs after weaning. So for many of you in the audience, you might understand that mat feeding is a common strategy that is used to increase feed availability after weaning for the young pig. But as you look through the literature, there's not a lot of data that supports or validates the protocols that are being used on farm. And so we decided to conduct a series of experiments, 3 experiments in total at Holden Farms, using just over 9,400 nursery pigs. And so for experiment 1, we looked at the difference between mat feeding versus no mat feeding. Experiment 2 was a 2x2 factorial in which we looked at the effects of diet form, so a pellet versus a crumble, and then the main effect of mat feeding, so with and without. And then for the third experiment, we looked at mat feeding a small versus a large pellet, and then a treatment in which no mat feed was provided. And so for all 3 of these experiments, regardless of pellet size or diet form, mat feeding had the same effect. So we're just going to focus on mat feed versus no mat feed. And so to give you a little bit of background of what these mats looked like that we used, for experiment 1 and 2, we used a single piece of an 18 by 24 inch DuraTough solid flooring, and this was actually installed into the floor of nursery pens. And so on this one mat, we provided 1 scoop of feed 3 times a day for 10 days post-placement. And then in experiment 3, we went ahead and installed a second mat, so then we could apply 2 scoops of feed on that mat for, again, 10 days post-placement for 3 consecutive feedings. And so when we combine the results from all 3 of these studies and just look at the total removal and mortality rate when mat feed was provided, we were able to reduce the total removal and mortality rate in pens that were provided mat feed as opposed to not mat fed. And so this therefore shows us this is a valid strategy for providing easier access to feed and then reducing fallout rates in nursery pigs after weaning. But one thing we do need to keep in mind is group-to-group variation. So when we separate this on an experiment basis, first looking at experiment 1, what you'll notice is that there was a significant difference in pigs that were provided mat feed as opposed to not mat fed when you look at the total removal and mortality rate. However, there was no statistical difference for experiment 2 and experiment 3. Although numerically, there was still a reduction in the percentage of pigs that were removed or mortalities when mat feed was provided. So this is just a good reminder for us that these intervention strategies do we can use these intervention strategies such as mat feeding to influence fallout rates, but we have to consider group-to-group variability. And so another strategy that is well established in the literature that helps acclimate pigs to solid feed prior to weaning is creep feed. And so with creep feed, there are challenges, one of the biggest being labor. So when it comes to maintaining and cleaning creep feeders in between sow groups. And so a lot of times what we'll see is producers or individuals will decide to just apply mat feed onto the mat of farrowing stalls, either a creep feed or simply the sow lactation feed. But there's not a lot of data in the literature that shows that that elicits a response post-weaning. So for this study, we decided to look at the effect of floor feeding a creep feed on the growth, performance, and mortality of pigs after weaning. And so we conducted a single experiment using 264 litters on a batch farrow farm with just under 9,500 nursery pigs. For this experiment, creep feed was provided for 4 days prior to weaning at half a pound inclusion per day, which was divided into 2 separate feedings. For this trial, there was 4 treatment groups, so a group in which no creep feed was provided, 2 groups in which a pelleted creep feed was provided, either a standard 1/8 inch pellet or a large 1/2 inch pellet, and then a group that was provided sow lactation feed. And then at weaning, these pigs were randomized to pens within their creep feed treatment group, and we tracked mortality throughout the nursery. And so just to give you a little bit of a visual of what these 3 creep feed treatment groups look like, on the left-hand side of your screen is that standard 1/8 inch pellet as compared to that large 1/2 inch pellet that you'll see in the center there. And then on the rightmost picture, that's just your standard lactation feed diet. And so looking at the results of this study at the total mortality and removals, and this is post-weaning, so after that creep feed was provided throughout the nursery from day 0 to 36, we observed that pigs that were provided large pelleted creep feed for 4 days prior to weaning had a reduction in total removals and mortalities as compared to the sow lactation feed, with the other 2 treatment groups being intermediate. And so then looking at total gain for these pigs on a per pig place basis from day 0 to 36 in the nursery, we also observed that pigs that were provided the large pellet creep feed had increased total gain compared to those that were provided the sow lactation feed, with the other 2 treatments being intermediate. So this was driven a little bit by feed intake, but more so, if we recall back to the previous slide, largely driven by removal and mortality rate, because this looks at total gain on a per pig placed basis. So with this study, what we can conclude is that by creep feeding on the floor rather than choosing to use feeders, we can elicit a response still when it comes to fallout rates and then potentially total gain in the nursery. And so switching gears just a little bit, and Emmeline would have done a nice job setting this one up for us, we conducted 3 trials looking at this concept of sensory learning. So sensory learning, the whole idea is that pigs are going to use their senses to go out and explore their pen or the environment around them. And so the hypothesis here is if we provide some sort of sensory attractant pre-weaning and then we reintroduce that same attractant post-weaning, there's going to be this recognition of the pig recognizing that attractant, and so it's going to reduce stress, increase their likelihood to go out, explore the pen, begin interacting with the feeder, and then hopefully start consuming feed sooner. And so we worked with TechMix on these 3 projects using 84 litters and just over 1,000 nursery pigs, and all 3 of these experiments had the exact same treatment structure. So it was a 2x2x2 factorial with the main effect of pre-weaning attractant, yes or no, post-weaning attractant, again, yes or no, and then body weight category. So we split the populations up into a lightweight body category that averaged right around 10.5 pounds, and then a heavyweight body category that averaged around 14.5 pounds. And so for these experiments, we used a different attractant for each. The first experiment, we looked at an enrichment cube, which resembles a large cattle cube. And you'll see a picture of that in the next slide. And so for this experiment, we applied these cubes for 4 days in the farrowing stall, just thrown on the floor because they were large, couldn't fall through the slats. For 4 days prior to weaning, and then after weaning for 3 days, we put these cubes in the feeder pan on top of their common diet. For experiment 2, we used a powdered attractant called Restart, and so this powder was applied for 4 days prior to weaning in a round feed pan in the farrowing crate, and then again post-weaning for 3 days top dressed on the feed in the feeder pan. And then for experiment 3, we did a spray attractant called Pro2 Lyte, in which Pro2 Lyte was sprayed on the underline of sows for 2 days immediately following farrowing, and then again for 2 days prior to weaning. Then once those pigs were weaned, they received it's 3 days post-weaning, that was sprayed on top of the feed in the feeder pan. And so before we go on, with all 3 of these experiments, growth performance and feed intake was not impacted. So what we're going to focus on today is how these intervention strategies changed the percentage of pigs that lost weight after weaning. So first, looking at experiment 1, these enrichment cubes, which I have some pictures on the screen, to show you the dimensions of these cubes on body weight loss after weaning. So with this trial, we saw limited effects of the application of these cubes prior to weaning. So I'm just going to show you the results of the application of these cubes post-weaning. So when pens of pigs were provided these cubes for 3 days after weaning, we saw a significant reduction in the percentage of pigs that lost weight as opposed to those that did not receive these cubes. And so then for experiment 2, using the powdered sensory attractant, or Restart, again looking at the percentage of pigs that lost weight after weaning. Here we're going to look at the interaction of pre-weaning application and post-weaning application on, again, the percentage of pigs that lost weight. So at day 3 post-weaning, that's going to be the graph on your left-hand side, we observed that pigs that were provided this powder attractant both pre and post-weaning, a lesser percent of them lost weight as compared to the other 3 treatment groups. So if those pigs did not receive any attractant or only received an attractant pre or post-weaning. Now, by day 7, this interaction, the significance of this interaction was diminished. However, you'll still notice that from a numerical standpoint, a lesser percent of the pigs that had received this attractant, both pre and post-weaning, lost weight. And so then looking at experiment 3, the spray attractant that we used was Pro2 Lyte. Again, at the percentage of pigs that lost weight after weaning. Now we're going to go ahead and look at the 3-way interaction. So this is the effect of application pre-weaning and post-weaning, as well as the difference between lightweight and heavyweight pigs. And so first, drawing your attention to the lightweight population of pigs, what we observed was that pigs that were provided sensory attractant spray prior to weaning but not post-weaning had a significant increase in the percentage of pigs that lost weight compared to the other 3 treatment groups. Whereas when you look at the heavyweight pig population, regardless of when that spray attractant was provided, either pre-weaning, post-weaning, or both pre and post-weaning, a lesser percentage of those pigs lost weight compared to having not received that attractant. And so when we think about all 3 of these experiments, we didn't affect growth performance, we didn't affect feed intake, but we consistently were able to influence the percentage of pigs that lost weight. Additionally, how these pigs are responding to these intervention strategies, we don't quite fully understand from a lightweight and heavyweight pig population, but there is a difference. So then another thing that we saw and looked at with this experiment was to dig a little bit deeper into the light and heavyweight pig population was just as a whole, how are these pigs responding after weaning, and what is the percentage of them that are losing weight? And so what we observed was that, looking at the graph on your left here first, at both day 3 and day 7 post-weaning, a greater percentage of the heavyweight pigs lost weight than the lightweight pigs. And so this does align with previous research, but it's a really good reminder for us, because I think in our heads, maybe that's not what we would initially go to. And so from a caretaker standpoint, it's really important that they understand that just because we're weaning a heavier pig doesn't mean we're weaning a more developmentally mature pig. So we need to make sure when we're in the barn, we're spending just as much time on those heavy weight or well-off pigs as we are on the lightweight pig population. And so then, just teasing these out, looking at the total population as a whole and the percentage of the total population that lost weight from one experiment or one group to the next for these 3 trials, what, again, I want to bring up is just the variability. So in experiment 1 and experiment 3, right around 40% of the population lost weight, as opposed to experiment 2, in which 86% of the population lost weight in the first 3 days after weaning. And so, again, these intervention strategies do have the opportunity to help pigs reduce the percentage of pigs that lose weight, but we do have to consider that that response may not be the same for every single group of pigs. And so then the last 2 experiments that we're going to talk through were at Pill and Family Farms, first looking at the effect of gruel feeding on the survivability of pigs after weaning. And so gruel feeding is, again, one of those strategies that is commonly used in the industry, but there's not a lot of research to support why it's used and what kind of effect we should anticipate to have with it. And so we conducted a single experiment using just over 3,000 nursery pigs at a 24,000 head hotel-style nursery site. And so when pigs were loaded into that site, they sorted out the bottom 10% or the smallest 10% of pigs, and those pigs were placed into designated small pens, and those were the pens that received gruel feed. And so for those pens, approximately 2.5 pounds of solid feed were added to the gruel feeders at the different feeding times, and then water was added and consistency was changed over the time of the experiment. So for this trial, we test the difference between gruel feeding twice a day versus 4 times a day, and then we tracked the removals and mortalities in these pens over the 14 days that we gruel fed. And so what we observed was that regardless if these pigs were gruel fed 4 times a day or 2 times a day, there was no evidence for treatment differences in total mortality. And so at the same time that this trial was going on, we were interested in taking a closer look at the pull pig population. And so one of our thoughts was that particularly in the first 1 to 2 weeks after weaning, that's that time window where you're going to see a lot of fallout pigs. You're going to see that post-weaning growth trek because pigs aren't eating, they're not consuming enough water, and they're losing body condition. And so because of that, their glucose stores should be pretty low. So our idea was, what if we give those pigs an oral dose of dextrose in order to give them a little bit of extra energy to hopefully encourage them to start consuming feed, drinking water, or moving around to find a warm place to lay. And so we conducted one experiment using 989 pull pigs from that same 24,000 head population. And so every other pig that was removed from a pen due to welfare concerns received a single 10 ml dose of a 50% dextrose solution. All the pigs that were removed were tagged. We took blood glucose levels on, body temperature, as well as body weight, and then we tracked mortalities from this removed population through the end of the nursery period. And so what we observed from the oral glucose was that there's no evidence for difference in total mortalities if we gave a pig oral glucose or we didn't. But one thing I do want to put into perspective for you guys when you're looking at this total mortality of 22% is that 22% seems high, right? But when we go back to our number, this is 989 pull pigs out of a total population of 24,000. So this is 4% of the population, which means of this 4% that was pulled, 20% of them were considered a mortality. And so what we then started to think about was, what is the likelihood of mortality when we consider the body temperature and the blood glucose level of these pigs when they're pulled from a pen and placed into a sick, fallback, pull pen, what have you. And so this is preliminary data. We're still working on finalizing it, but it tells us a really good story. And so each point on these graphs represents a predicted probability of mortality. And so first, looking at body temperature on the left-hand side of the screen, what we observed was a positive quadratic relationship. So when pigs were pulled, if they had a body temperature that was in the normal range from about 101 to 103.5, their predicted mortality was under 25%. However, as their body temperature increased or decreased, their probability of death increased subsequently. And so similarly, when we look at blood glucose, and this is the one that I think has piqued our interest a little bit in trying to really understand what's going on from a metabolic standpoint, is these pigs that entered and had a normal blood glucose range from 70 to 120 milligrams per deciliter, their probability of mortality was under 25%. And so what we predicted was that if these pigs had really low blood glucose, their probability of mortality would be high. And so we did see that their probability of mortality was higher than those that had a normal blood glucose range. But what we observed was actually, as that blood glucose increased, their probability of mortality was greater. And specifically, as they got closer to a blood glucose level of 300, that probability of mortality became 100%. And so the one thing I do have to point out is the number of points. There's not a ton of pigs up here, but it is something that has piqued our interest and tells us that there's something metabolically going on in these pigs that we don't necessarily have a full understanding of. And so with all that, I just want to give you a few take-home points of what we've learned about the young pig in the last couple of years. And so the big one for this presentation is that body weight loss and fallout rates can be improved through strategic feeding and management programs, whereas feed intake and growth are more challenging to influence. So that's something to keep in our back pocket as we're planning research trials in this particular area. Also, when we're thinking about future research trials, just as Emmeline talked about, we need to think about behavior because I like to consider the young pig as no different than a puppy. They love to play, they want to socialize. When it comes to feeding, it's more fun to do it together. And so we have to take into account the fact that their behavior is really going to drive how they're responding to the environment around them. We can't just disregard that. And so the next point is genetics. So that's a conversation that I think is being had more and more, or at least those conversations I've been involved with more and more, and that genetics, specifically right after weaning, is playing a larger role than maybe we once credited. So we really need to think about that not all genetic lines are created equal, and we need to consider that they do have different growth curves, and how does that impact the time it takes for these different genetic line pigs to begin consuming feed after placement, and how does that also affect their gut health and the development of the GI tract, as well as stress. And so with that, the final points that I just want to mention is that when we think about pig population as a whole, unless there's a health challenge, it's not always the entire population. It's usually that bottom 10% that we really seem to struggle with that can bring the whole turn down, right? And so when we think about research, I think we need to start to also consider ways that we can really hone in on that bottom 10% of the population to really understand them, even as far as going down to an individual level. And so with all this in mind, I think as an industry, it's really important for us to continue this collaboration and conducting research, not just in university settings, but on commercial farms, because that's gonna be what helps us generate this mortality data and also gives us some really applicable information and teaches us a lot. So with that, I do just want to say thank you all for being here, and also thank you to the grant for allowing me the opportunity to speak for you guys today.